Intersectionality roundtable, and Dr. Latifa Laghzaoui, Faculty of Social Anthropology, and bring to Dr. Inequality, and Ms. Suhasha, Student Engagement Manager and alum of Webster, and Chilli, MA International Relations student. It's a privilege for me to be here today, and I think I'm going to start with the first question. My first question is for Ms. Nathalie. And today we heard about the importance of allyship. It's a process of sticking up for one another. So in your opinion, what is the best way for students for being allies and sticking up for one another in terms of gender equality and gender-based violence?
Thank you. I think the event today has created allies in this room. I think a women's and gender studies class at a university creates allies. But I want to add a word that hasn't come up today that is an important word, and that is intersectionality. There are women who suffer from multiple oppressions because of class, race, color, because they live in rural communities rather than cities. And one of the challenges for us today, and for women everywhere in the world who are relatively privileged, and those of you in this room are relatively privileged, is to remember the stories of those women around the world who face challenges that go far beyond anything that we can know. Part of the education process that we are going through today and that we go through in the Women's and Gender Studies course is to displace your notion of where women are and what they face, what challenges they face. So I think intersectionality is an important word. The second thing I want to repeat is that it's important for men to be allies. This is not a zero-sum game. If we have an equitable society where there will always be gender differences, but where gender is not striated with power, where women are not less than. Can you imagine that world? But the work doesn't begin with people your age. As UN Women have made clear, we have to start education at a very early age. At 3 years old, children have internalized gender roles from their parents, same-sex parents. And they learn these distinctions, and they learn that a woman, even if there is a strong, mother, is less than. We have to change that at a very early age, which means that government, civil society, organizations like UN Women have to create programs not only to educate children in the schools at an early age, but to train parents who have grown up with certain customs, to train parents that teaching girls that they're less than and teaching boys that they are empowered creates a society of imbalances, which the worst symptom of it we've heard today is gender-based violence. But there are so many other spin-offs of this. So creating allies is a complex problem, but it is remembering that all the people in the world deserve gender equality and need it. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a very powerful message, and I agree with. Like we all have to recognize intersectionality, because to recognize the imbalance of the power, we also have to recognize those in the marginalized group, the privilege, the difference, and to meet the equality, to real respect people that have human dignity, all are equal. You should have to recognize all the aspects. And I agree with the conversation about the conversation must start from the young age, and all sectors are responsible for this change. Thank you, Dr. Nathalie, again. My next question is for Dr. Laghzaoui. Are there ways that the university can collaborate with or regularly consult with students in order to ensure that youth voices are heard when implementing best practice for achieving gender equality and ending violence?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take that question back a little bit. I think it's very important that we involve students not at the implementation stage, but actually have them take part in the discussion, in the preparations of those strategies and policies that universities develop. Because students then can have ownership of those policies, and by having ownership, they will work better with the university to implement those strategies. So in a sense, what I'm saying is that we need to avoid the sort of top-down approach to developing gender equality policies. One way of doing that is you could set up some kind of governance machinery that would help implement those strategies. And by that I mean it could be groups of students together with faculty or other staff at the university. They're working together and putting much emphasis on communication and how you develop the best way of communicating that strategy to the rest of the students who are not actively involved in those governance teams. So it could be developing appropriate training sessions, or basically building commitment to report and implement on processes. Another point to really add to this is that when we have gender equality policies, these should be living documents. These should be reviewed and assessed on a regular basis. And so that's monitoring and assessment has to happen regularly. There are various awareness raising points or sessions that could be held, and that would involve students as much as other faculty, because let's be honest, it's not just about students. It's also the awareness that staff and faculty and management at universities need to have. Having the policy is one thing, but being able to implement it and being aware of the ins and outs of it is something that needs constant work. So I would say that those are really very key areas in terms of the policy level and how you work and collaborate with the students.
Thank you so much. Another question is about what about in the classroom?
Yeah.
How we create the classroom that's safe and help achieving gender equality in the classroom? Yeah,
I think that's a really, really important question, because we do have that forum, and it's a unique forum that we have as faculty and as students to work together and make the most out of those policies and how they can be implemented. To have a gender-sensitive classroom actually needs a gender-sensitive faculty. This is really key. Both sides need to be developed. You need, as faculty in particular, you need to confront your own gender biases in order to be able to communicate that gender sensitivity and the gender equality policies that you're talking about. The issue of intersectionality has already been raised, and I cannot highlight or stress enough its importance. I'm not going to go into that again. I think my colleague here has spoken very well about that particular point. Other small things that you do, you need to introduce a gender-neutral language. it's quite amazing how many syllabi you can see, or university curriculums that you see, that have no gender aspect to them at all. So for example, if I'm developing a syllabus on a particular issue, I try my hardest to have a number of women authors in the list of references and bibliographies. This is really key. Students need to know that that topic is not just, does not just have a male perspective. There's also a female perspective there. When you getting students to work as a group, try and have gender balance. It's not always easy, because my last class, it was all men. So it's not really easy to have gender balance there. But as much as you can, try and have gender balance. And always encourage students to integrate the gender dimension in their research. It could be a little bit, sometimes they think, oh, it's an added burden. It's not. This is part of the whole gender mainstreaming efforts. And gender mainstreaming has been one of the key policies of academia for decades now. It's almost like it's passé. It should be mainstream. And that's the kind of thing that you need to encourage students to do in the research.
Thank you so much for complete recommendation. Because sometimes it's about how everyday life, it starts from like your thoughts. And that's a very thought-provoking recommendation. It's trying to remind us that it's not about how you speak, how you use the words, how you use the language. Sometimes it's not just about policy, because that's a policy, but how it being implemented in the classroom, in the faculty, that's very important. Thank you again, Dr. Laghzaoui. And now I would like to direct my next question to Dr. Click. How can young adults and universities benefit from and engage with larger movements such as HeForShe? And how can the goals of these movements be incorporated in higher education?
Thank you, and I just wanted to build on some of my colleagues' words today, which I really appreciate. So I think some of this starts with this idea of us all just being human beings, right? I think it's really easy to say in this case too. I know some people were joking and they said, oh, you're the only male up there today. What are you going to do? I'm just going to talk like a human being. And some of the issues you're seeing worldwide, globally, including the US, which has been identified, is polarization. Okay? They call it identity politics. And I think that's really unfortunate, because a lot of people turn off to these very positive messages that affect all of us. And so that's some of what I want to talk about, so I appreciate the question. We are in privileged positions, okay, to be able to talk about this openly and so forth. I think that it starts with all of us saying together that this behavior is unacceptable. Okay? It's unacceptable behavior. And then it comes to, okay, what are we going to do about it being unacceptable? A lot of us, if you just talk about from a business standpoint, for example, everybody's very outcome orientated. You can't just focus in on the outcomes. I think it's very important, as my colleagues have talked about, what are the inputs, what are the processes? Systemically, how are we going to stop this sort of behavior? And it just comes down to having these conversations and talking about how we're all humans and how this actually affects all of us. Gender inequity is very important to higher education and beyond. For example, in the US right now, you have about 60% of the students are actually females. Some of the issues you're seeing in the US relative to that is actually a backlash with men feeling like they're left behind, okay? For those of you who aren't from the US, I recently came from the US, and a lot of what's going on in the US, it's hard to tell relative to the news, but some of it's actually even worse than perhaps you're seeing. There is this kind of evolution, there is to a certain extent a backlash, and they're almost regressive in some of the policies that are occurring. And I think it's very unfortunate, because people want to label the issue instead of dealing with the issue in a productive manner and saying, hey, we're all human beings here, and these are issues that affect every one of us. So for example, in the US, of course, you have Title IX. Title IX is looking a lot at gender inequity and how can you ensure that females have the same education opportunities. But again, in this day and age, to have to ensure that females have the same opportunities says a lot about how far we still need to go, okay? Those are strange conversations, at least to me, that have to be constantly had. And I do agree, you have to recognize that these biases do exist. I've done administration for about 20 years, and you see them. You see them all the time. And sometimes, too, you have to be reflective in yourself on how perhaps you're actually even carrying out some of these biases. In addition, there's, of course, you hear about in the US right now, the Me Too movement. And again, everybody can talk about Bill Cosby, for example, what he did maybe 20 years ago. That's pretty appalling behavior. There's examples, again, every day currently in the US or beyond. I think it's very important to not just label these issues in the past, but talk about them in the present, which can really affect the future. We can't control the past, but we can control the future through our present behavior. In addition, I know there's a lot of diversity and inclusion movement as a whole within higher education, but I also encourage you to take a look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, this fits into a larger movement I've been lucky enough to be involved in recent years, including helping build some of this into the curriculum, because I think that's very important to operationalize it in learning, because that can also help in the workforce. But central, if you look at those goals, they will tell you all 17 goals that should be accomplished by the year 2030, you cannot accomplish them without women and gender equality. Okay, so it's that important. And so I think that relative to diversity and inclusion, also, I know a lot of people want to talk about how we're all the same. And I think in a lot of ways we are. Again, we're all human beings. But what my colleagues have touched upon is people shouldn't be ashamed of how they're different. Okay, that's very powerful. People's uniqueness, their specialities, and I think we should celebrate not just how we're the same, but how we're different and how we can harness that. Okay, there are differences between men and females. There are differences between genders and so forth. And I think that's okay. And I think at some point too, that's been lost a little bit sometimes in these conversations. So I would encourage all of us to celebrate that. And again, as a final note, coming from the West, for a long time it was this idea that the West led the way. Okay? For many of us, the West has seemingly kind of lost their way. I would put out a call, just like if I was in the West right now, for the West to lead that charge. Whether or not the West leads that charge or not, I think it's, I've been here in the East, it's also time for the East to lead that charge. This is everyone's charge. And so I encourage all of us to do our part. Again, this isn't just a female or a male issue. Move beyond kind of these labels and say to yourself, we're all human beings and we can all benefit from this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. I have another question, but before I move on, I'd like all of you, if you have any questions for the panels, you can go to the slider and leave the questions. I read it out in the end. So thank you so much. I have another question. To create gender equality, what about in campus? How can men and boys be a part of this conversation, take action to end violence against women and girls, now that we recognize that women by statistics more exposed to, more vulnerable to gender-based violence, but it doesn't mean men is not affected by gender-based violence. In the campus, with group of friends, how they can do it.
Yeah, and just kind of build on a little bit what I've talked about is, again, you have to operationalize it. So you can't just talk about it, you have to put it into action. And again, as my colleagues have talked about too, that means diversity in the classroom, that means diversity in student organizations, that means putting them into your policies, where not only is there a reward for doing that, but there's also not a reward when that's not done. So the other thing is too, again, people moving beyond just the identity and saying, hey, it's okay if males are in this group or females are in this group, but it's having to have more dialogue and talking about, again, not how it just affects you, but how it affects everyone. But I do think it's important, and I think that this platform gives you this, including the UN Sustainability Development Goals, is to actually build this in curriculum. And that tends to help. And if you build it into the curriculum and the policies, then you can also start to go together, which I will hand the mic shortly to our student affairs expert, but you can build them into what we call co-curriculars, which just is an example. and you can actually have this going on in events throughout the university. And I think that's great to see, because that's diversity and inclusion in action. If not, it's just words.
Thank you so much. Now, okay, now my next question is for Suhasha. What mechanisms that the university currently have in place to combat gender inequality or gender-based violence? And what is the best way for students to access these resources, and are there ways that we can improve existing service?
I think difficult question, because you need to find a policy scapegoat, and I think someone found it. I think we'll start part by part. So as I think some of my colleagues have already pointed out, at WebsterThailand we do abide by Webster University's networks rules. So we are under the Title IX. If you don't know what the Title IX is, it basically states that we're not allowed to discriminate based on gender or sexuality, right? So every staff and every faculty that joins WebsterThailand goes through this training that is mandated by Webster St. Louis. That's the simple answer. How I was a student before, and what I would say is, when asked how to access these resources, it's easy for a staff member to answer it because we know exactly where we put them. But as a student, it's often not that easy, right? Because you don't look for it until there is a need to look for it. And when there is a need to look for it, the situation is quite dire. We do try to incorporate these kinds of things. We tried at orientation when the students first come in. We thought, they're fresh. We try it in the first go, and I think some of the students who were part of that project, so to say, are here, and we try to play this video, try to make it as comfortable and friendly and open as possible, but kind of backfired, because no one wants to hear about these things on their first day of university, right? So what we have done is try to open up a course that's called Webster 101. All the new students are on it. We try to have these kind of dialogues there. Our counselor just had a session there as well. And we try to incorporate different kinds of people who could be of help during these situations, and also kind of make the students aware, once they're a little bit settled in and a little more comfortable to talk about these things, to be able to ask questions. Like I said, the first day was definitely not the right choice, but we are evolving, and I think that's important. To kind of recognize feedback is important. So we had essential feedback and we try to incorporate it. We are evolving. We're definitely not perfect in our policy implementation and how we make these resources available to students, but we are moving forward, I think, in the right direction.
Thank you. So I would like to know, as a student of that, do you experience any case that occur from the different culture and gender roles? Like, if that kind of case happen, how does university deal with this issue?
Okay, tough one again. So I think our issue is kind of twofold. So one is that we have a variety of cultures, so the definitions of gender roles vary a lot of the times, and how we approach some scenarios is quite challenging because it becomes a class session on its own. You got to explain where the person who has, kind of felt this discrimination or violence against them, where they're coming from, to the accused, and then you have to hear their perspective, because sometimes, in some cases, we found that it's such a big barrier in their culture. They've been brought up this way, they've been socialized this way, and we cannot break that down in one sitting, right? It's just so challenging because you're just there looking at them and you're questioning everything they've learned since they were a kid. So we're put in this position where these students are part of our family. We're a very small university, and we're trying not to offend them of who they are, who they identify themselves as, but also try to explain to them that, these roles are evolving. They need to learn more, need to be a bit more educated. Even at orientation, we tell them, when you have to ask a question, maybe not make it so narrow and direct, be open. Don't ask. I get asked a lot, you're from Nepal, do you climb Mount Everest? And I mean, that's, look at me one. obviously not, and definitely not doing that, right? But how do we make that a more open conversation? Without, you don't have to ask me if I've climbed Mount Everest, just because I'm from Nepal, right? So we're trying to create a little more open, friendlier dialogue. Kids are curious, students are curious. I was in that place, you definitely want to ask some questions, but try to guide them to a way that can be generated into a more positive dialogue.
That's amazing, because then the more we have the conversation among the youth to acknowledge about the sensitivity, about the differences, is a way to start for them to starting to learn slowly, and create change among your university. And my last question, I'm gonna go to Chilli. There are many students clubs and associations on campus. Do any of them take gender into account, and other ways to be more gender aware when establishing clubs? For example, the women's or the sports team, etc.
So let's tracing back to when I first joined Webster in 2017. It's like during fall, I as far as I recall. So I realized that Webster has like this, we're in such a small community, and we're very fortunate that we're like family. We're living in this family environment where it's very different from where I came from. I spent half of my life in Thai school, study in my Thai university, a very big one, and actually, I have to say that in Thai university, like men tends to play like key roles. In like, it could be like head of the faculties or things like that, like everywhere, like we see like men playing all these roles. And after I came here, like at Webster, it would just kind of change my mind. And as I mentioned before, that our community here is very close, and we're lucky that gender is not what we consider as a barriers. I have seen a lot of women leaders engaging in our student government association, but also as well as like clubs. We have Thai clubs leading by all women's, and we also have clubs like media clubs down in Cham, and we're like collaborating a lot. Like there's no such thing as gender as a barriers, and also I have like a very lucky opportunities to talk to one of my colleagues. He is running the public speaking club here at Webster, and what he is trying to do right now is to collab like the 5th goal of the UN Women, like consider gender, and I believe that he is also here with us today in this room. So let me point out to Jintan over there. I'm sitting in the 3rd row. We have a chance to discuss that during this fall semester. He will open like a session where the topic will be consider how to end gender inequalities among our peers, if there is any. And there will be like a section where we can share, and then we can come up with like an initiatives or some campaign among our like friends. So yeah, that would be it.
Thank you so much. Big round of applause for all. But I'm not going to let any one of you go. Yes, we have a question from the student. But I'd like to say that hearing all of this just made me like to go back to university again and join your club. And
before we start the questions, I had this down, but the last testimonial, I really do think it starts with kindness. You pointed that out, and I think a lot of times too, if you get emotional, people get charged. But if you take a step back, you take a breath. I think kindness really is important in situations. So thank you for sharing that.
We received this question from the participants today. How are we supposed to combat gender inequality in different cultures? So the audience didn't say direct to who, but any of you can answer this. How are we supposed to combat gender inequality in different cultures?
don't think there's one answer to that. There are many different cultures around the world. And even in this room, we have people we've heard with different backgrounds, come from different cultures. We've also heard at the beginning of the day that gender is socialized. There may be differences that are noticeable, but our gender behavior is socialized. There's no question about it. It's not innate. But gender and gender roles differ in different countries of the world. As I tried to point out earlier, we cannot make a generalization by sitting in this room. That's why the UN Women, their work that they're doing is so important, because they check with different governments around the world, because you can have laws in place, but the customs are stronger than the laws. So while the laws may say that women, for example, can own property, or while the law has been changed in India now to make LGBTQ people no longer people who are regarded as criminals and can be punished, once that law is changed, that doesn't mean the culture changes. And that has been the case that UN Women have found all around the world. So we have to be positive. As Emma Thompson said, we cannot tolerate the status quo. It may look good on the surface of it, but it's not. And the stories that we heard today are stories from people who have felt the brunt of gender inequity. So when you ask a question like that, it's a great question, but to try to answer it is exactly the work that remains before us. Because I can tell you a quote that is in my textbook and that I teach, that if all women are not free, no woman is free. So we cannot sit here in our smugness, because there are women outside this room who have just as much at stake in their lives as we do. I ask you to find out about those women. I ask you to find ways to help those women in your countries or in other countries. So that is my answer.
I just add a really small point. Cultures can be blamed for all sorts of things. That's just not good enough. It's so broad and so vague that people often say, oh, this is cultural. Well, if it's harming more than half the population, if it's alienating people, if it's marginalizing many sections in a society, those norms have to change. Those changes can only happen, though, from within. And we've seen that in various societies and groups within societies, where people strive and work and develop their lives making those changes to make that culture more equal and fairer to everybody. And I think that's what really needs to happen. To blame culture for everything is a sort of easy cop-out. And we need to fight that. We need to go beyond it and make those changes, again, from within.
And just to kind of build on that a little bit too, let's say from a business standpoint, okay? When you teach us, a lot of business is done, it's interdisciplinary, it's intersectoral, it's intergovernmental, okay? So some of this, when you start to teach about this, is the idea of how are those contractual arrangements being made, all right? So basically, it's just, are these mutually beneficial? Are people voluntarily entering into these agreements, okay? A lot of this in personal relationships is very similar as in professional relationships, and I think what comes up a lot today is power and influence, and the abuse of power and influence. So it does transcend cultures. If people are not voluntarily agreeing, whether it's personally or professionally, to arrangements, then that alone in itself is a sign. And that's something that should change. And so, again, I agree with my colleagues. I think it's very easy to talk about these in abstract terms, but it's very important for individuals to put some of these principles into practice. And it's very easy, again, for people to conduct business and say, well, I don't live in this culture. That's not really my place. Isn't it? It is, it's everyone's place.
Could I just add a little bit? I think we're just going to go one by one. I just wanted to share something that I usually find very intriguing. I haven't lived in Nepal for a long time, but we come from a culture that's quite not so nice to women, I guess, to put it softly. And there's this thing in Nepal, I don't know if you know about it, that when a woman is menstruating, uncomfortable topic, that you're not allowed to touch a man, you're not allowed to be in the same room as a man, you're not allowed to cook, you're not allowed to go touch a monument of a god, whatever. So since I don't live in Nepal, I barely go every year once to stay there 2 weeks. And then I find myself in this position where I know all these things, right? I know that this doesn't make sense. I know that this is oppressive. I know these things to my core, but suddenly I find myself uncomfortable, and it puts you in a position where you are surrounded by these people who believe in this culture, who have been brought up. I was brought up in this culture, and it's hard to put yourself out of that, right? When you've been there, and I always tell my friends, it's a joke that I can only be there 12 days and that's my limit, and then I start turning into this person that I was, and then you just start hating yourself because you're like, yeah, I shouldn't be going into the kitchen. Like, you're just hesitating, and that itself, then you start to hate yourself, right? So I would say, what the biggest thing I took away from Webster and being in a class that was so diverse with professors that were so qualified is that the basic thing that you could do is maybe just be open to learning, open to asking the positive questions, rather than victim blaming, culture bashing. I think the first step to anything is to learn, right? Learn about each other and then go from there, rather than making assumptions.
I know we don't have much time, but as the moderator, I'm not supposed to answer this, right? But can I say something? I feel like gender-based violence happen everywhere, even right now, and there's no prevalent information that can be correct about what happened the most in the community in each country. It happened every country, every community, all the time. But the thing is, you ask how we're gonna end it in a different culture, but you know your culture, right? For example, from Suhasha talk about Nepali culture. I'm Thai, I know my culture. So once you know your culture, you are an expert of the problem too. And you can be the one who create how to end inequality. That's simple. Yeah. I'll probably have more questions.
And maybe I can piggyback on that, based on my experience as a student. I just want to really highlight the fact that we're in such a very fortunate environment that we are here right now. As Sue said that you've been here more than back in Nepal, and I would say that a lot of our students, I have been friends with a lot of Westerners, but also a lot of Asians. I have a lot of friends from Nepal, from India, and from every corners of the world you can think of, name it. So I would say that everybody in the society that we're in the communities that we have right now, we are very open, and culture is what is more not as important as it was back in their countries. Here we all can be friends, It doesn't matter like if it's that time of the month or any time you can possibly think of. And we're like very open to share what happened to us. Like we are all just friends here, and that is what I really appreciate to be part of this.
So, one of the popular questions, we have so many questions. What do we do when a professor is discriminating against our gender, our sexuality without backlash because it's a small university? I think it's a question from Professor. Oh, anyway.
I guess, yeah, I'll just answer the policy question first. I would say we have steps, right? So if you're suffering through any of this, if you faced any of this, I would recommend that you contact the Director of Student Affairs. He's our Title IX point person. You can file a formal complaint and there will be an investigation launched. This is, we are mandated by this, so there will be an investigation that will be launched on your claim, and then we'll go from there. Sometimes the thing about protocols and procedures is that it may take some time, but we are here to listen to you. We are here to support you, so I would say that first.
When I started teaching at the university, it was widely known that a professor at our university was sleeping with one of the students. That professor was never disciplined. It was tolerated. And in fact, he went on to have a long career. I think we can all feel relieved that we are much closer to a zero tolerance situation when a professor is not being professional in the classroom. And I would say that I can't comment on that particular question, but I can say that discrimination in the classroom is something that should not happen, no matter who the student is. If it's a matter of gender, a matter of race, a matter of, it doesn't matter. So I'm not sure what, Sue told you what to do, but let's all be clear, just as we learned about violence against women, zero tolerance. Particularly in education, this is not something that we should live with.
And to briefly build on that, these issues really are on a spectrum. So I've been in higher education about 20 years, and there's some things that are just clear-cut abuses. There's other things that are much more subtle, okay? So there's what's legal versus what's ethical, and vice versa. So I think it's really important that if you, particularly with power and influence, because that's what she was speaking to, there are clear-cut situations as that, where that's an abuse of power, okay? And those situations should be dealt with, and they should be dealt with rather swiftly. So you certainly, if you're in any situation remotely similar to that, not only can you obviously report that to university officials, but in some of these situations, I think it's important to understand that you should report that to the appropriate authorities too, as is. You don't have to wait for university officials to get involved in those situations. On other situations though, some of this is cross-cultural communication issues. And it's not just with students that there's cross-cultural communication issues. Sometimes it's with instructors. And we do have a diverse amount of instructors. So sometimes I think that there are things that are done subtly that people may not realize that they're making people feel uncomfortable. And so it's important to have those kind of conversations also and say that, hey, even if it's just that's how someone feels, you're making me feel uncomfortable by doing such and such. And I've seen a number of those instances, and why I think that's important is somebody can say, oh, I really I didn't mean to do that. So again, these are issues on a spectrum, but I do think it comes back to the theme today of a lot of the issues are very clear cut. When you get into abuse of power in particular, we really do encourage you to report those issues and report them quickly. But even if it's just an issue of subtlety, again, have those conversations, and there's many university officials that are open to hear that. Because sometimes people are just simply, they're just miscommunicating.
Thank you so much. I have to choose one more question, which is very difficult. I want to choose everything. Okay, let's go with it. How are we supposed to expect gender equality classroom when the majority of professors are men? Ouch. Okay, let's go with it.
No, I think that's a fair point. And again, when you look at right now, for example, in the US, 60% of the people, it may even be higher now, that are getting PhDs are females. Okay, but you're seeing this across occupations. This is a global phenomenon. Why are women not in these leadership roles? Why are women not in the classroom more? So I think that's legitimate, and I think that we can do better, and others can do better too. I know upon my arrival, one of the first things I asked was, what's our percentage of females in the classroom? Because it seemed a little low to me. So I do think it's important to have that diversity.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do have the privilege of having quite good faculty, regardless of their gender. So let me give that to them. And the content is, in my experience, never made me feel like we're, it makes a difference whether it's been taught by a man or a female. But I think the idea of this is to start these kind of dialogues and to make sure that we are having faculty who are aware of these kind of situations, and we are training our faculty and staff constantly to make sure that we are at par for these kinds of situations.
And you, to build on that, again, in diversity and inclusion situations, you can't make people, take a job. Particularly though, you have to look at too why people aren't applying for jobs sometimes. So are you doing things to put people in a position and making sure that they know that we certainly want that diversity also?
Thank you so much. I think there are a lot more questions. Can you give a big round of applause for our and I hope this conversation can go a lot more, because sometimes it's just within 2-3 minutes we cannot talk and cover everything. This issue is sensitive, and also there's a lot more questions. There's some questions directly to the UN Women, and I think you can come to the UN Women and ask directly, and we have the sexual harassment, gender-based violence, and LGBT activists here, and you can go to them and ask the question as well. Thank you so much for today, and I hope this conversation has given us to think about something and how to create the real gender equality, because at the end of the day, we're gonna stay together and we have to work and go towards the same cause. Thank you so much.